And we see that with our current government not planning for future impacts and just responding to particular climate extreme events. And the problem with that is that there's not dedicated funding to enable communities to plan forward. And if you have a 1 in 100-year flood that then becomes more and more frequent, those communities need to be supported to, align urban planning policy and their critical infrastructure to events that will become more and more frequent.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. A banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and today we're going to take you through the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which focuses on the impacts of climate change and on adaptation. In the report, climate scientists have warned that catastrophic flooding on the scale of the disaster hitting Queensland right now and New South Wales is going to become more likely as the planet heats due to greenhouse gas emissions rising. Some regional and urban areas will likely face some irreversible changes that could impact millions of people's lives because of sea level rises, heat waves and lower productivity farming thanks to changing weather patterns.
Once again, Australians are battling a natural disaster on a scale never seen before.
It's a stark warning from the world's most authoritative climate science group.
United Nations report the devastating impacts of human-caused climate change are happening
Today
now.
warns it's about to get worse.
Is warning more needs to be done to help the country adapt to a climate that is already changing.
It says the failure to take the climate crisis seriously means the window to adapt to the changes we're facing is closing.
In terms of adaptation, we don't have much time because climate change is right on top of us and it's hurting.
There are limits to how much we and other species can adapt. Beyond certain temperatures, adaptation is no longer possible.
Now, I would argue this is another code red for humanity.
That over 3 billion people, nearly half the planet's population, are living in harm's way because of global warming.
The Secretary-General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, was blunt about the failure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, saying, quote, "This abdication of leadership is criminal."
And the damning indictment of failed climate leadership. The world's biggest polluters are guilty of arson on our only home.
The world's biggest polluters are guilty of arson on our only home. But the good news is, if we act urgently, we can avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So to talk about this latest IPCC report, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Johanna Nalau from Griffith University, an ARC Discovery Early Career Research Fellow and an IPCC lead author on Chapter 15 on Small Islands, as well as Alia Armistead, a climate researcher from our climate and energy team here at the Australia Institute. Welcome, Johanna and Alia. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Johanna, I'll start with you. Can you just tell us, to begin with, what is in this latest IPCC report and why is it important?
Thanks, Ebony. I mean, it's obviously a massive report, and so we have so many messages across. But I think one of the really, really key messages is that climate change is here. So we are already seeing the impacts of climate change. Those are, the report is documenting a lot of the impacts and vulnerabilities as well. So the kind of idea that climate change is something that, will happen in, far in the future, I think that report really dispels that idea. What the report is really, really saying is that the window of opportunity is really closing. So we need climate action now, and we need to start putting in place also adaptation strategies and starting to think about really what we can do now to help to keep our communities safe in the future. The report has lots and lots of examples of, for instance, what's already happening to ecosystems, but also what's happening to communities across the world. And I personally, so I worked on Small Islands chapter, but also on adaptation in the summary for policymakers as well. And there's lots of doom and gloom messages coming from the report, but there's also lots of examples of what we can still do.
Just to stick with the actual impacts that are here with us right now, because that did seem to be one of the main messages, is that there already has been warming and climate change isn't this thing off in the future. It's actually here with us and the impacts are here with us now. What are some of the impacts that you think we should pay attention to in this report globally? What are some of those examples that you can give us of where we can see those impacts already?
Well, I mean, I think one of the key issues that is very relevant, for instance, on small islands is the tropical cyclones. So there has already been studies looking at the kind of human influence on that. And the scenarios and projections are saying as well that, tropical cyclones and extreme storm events will increase in the future, especially in intensity. So some of those we have already seen.
I've been living here for nearly 30 years and I've never seen it like this. This is unbelievable.
The flood waters, they were not that high in the extreme flood of 1954, 1974 or 2017.
The so-called rain bomb is putting nearly 1,500 homes at risk.
It's equivalent to 80% of the rainfall that we would receive in 1 year.
Days-long rain dumped a metre of rain in some areas.
This is an unprecedented event.
The report warns in Australia heat will reach the limit of human survivability.
And you are dead right. The IPCC is dead right.
Australia's dealing with some pretty big extreme weather at the moment itself. How does this report connect with what we're currently seeing in Australia?
Well, it absolutely does connect, and it does that by saying things like the impacts that we're already experiencing now are absolutely exacerbated by climate change. And it does that by going back to the Black Summer bushfires and saying that climate change definitely helped fuel those. And we can see what was happening in northern New South Wales and Queensland today, and then look at this report and understand that climate change is already exacerbating things like flooding from sea level rise. And the report specifically says that the current 1 in 100-year flood in Australia could occur several times a year under current projected sea level rises, and that Australia is not really prepared for those kinds of impacts, but that it's absolutely not too late for us to adapt to many of the impacts that we will be facing.
And Australia already is home to all kinds of extreme weather. Obviously, we've got the Black Summer bushfires. We also have a lot of heat waves across a lot of our capital cities and elsewhere. So it really is a huge issue for Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. So the report says that globally, all regions are already experiencing an increase in heat-related mortality and morbidity. And that is true for Australia as well. And our own research has showed that under projected warming, areas like Western Sydney that are particularly vulnerable to heat impacts could experience up to a 5-fold increase in days over 35 degrees, which is extremely scary. And vulnerable regions like that do need to take pretty rapid adaptation measures if they're going to be able to cope with things like that.
The report warns climate change will also lead to increased deaths and illness from heat, malnutrition, malaria and gastro, as well as increasing threats to mental health.
So speaking of adaptation, coming back to you, Johanna, how are other countries preparing to adapt to the impacts of climate change? What does this report talk about in terms of adaptation?
I mean, we have more and more evidence in this report on actual progress on adaptation as well. So, for instance, globally, we have over 170 countries and so many cities that have integrated adaptation into their policies and planning processes as well. So it is being mainstream, and it's becoming one of those kind of day-to-day issues as well for many policy and decision makers. And there's lots of decision support tools and climate services assisting also that decision making. And we have seen an increasing number of adaptation projects implemented worldwide. And there's lots of investments as well that is being funded for adaptation globally. Although the report does, especially the summary for policymakers, does say that finance is unfortunately still quite insufficient.
That is why I've been pushing to get the 50% of all climate finance for adaptation. The Glasgow Commitment on Adaptation funding is not enough to meet the challenges faced by nations on the front lines of the climate crisis. I'm also pressing to remove the obstacles that prevent small island states and least developed countries from getting the finance they desperately need to save lives and livelihoods.
So finance is still quite insufficient, and that's something we need to address globally. But there's a lot of other countries who are already looking into and making plans for adaptation. Could you just give me a couple of specific examples, Johanna, for people who don't really know what adaptation looks like? Like, what kind of problems are local, state and federal governments internationally having to deal with and plan for?
I think that's such a good question, because I think that cuts to the core of adaptation as well. That it's really complex, because we have to implement adaptation across sectors, but also we have to look at the unintended consequences of some of those adaptations as well. So that's also some of the things that we talk about in this report specifically is on maladaptation. So where one sector, for instance, decides to implement an action that then impacts negatively on another sector. But there's so much that is already being done. And so for city examples, for instance, we have New York. So New York has extensively been starting to look at nature-based options for adaptation. So, for instance, restoring wetlands, trying to think about nature in a very, beneficial way. So how can some of the adaptation actions that we take, for instance, to reduce the chance of flooding in urban areas, how can that also, those same actions, for instance, in building parks, how can those actions also increase benefits for biodiversity? And for instance, green roofs, building urban parks, they also have a documented impact on heat. So those would be reducing heat, for instance, in the urban areas. So a lot of the adaptation actions, and this is what we are seeing in the report, is that they actually have multiple benefits. And that's also something that we are looking at. So a lot of the adaptations can lead to better agricultural productivity, health and well-being, for instance, from ecosystem-based measures, as I said as well.
Yeah, because I can imagine, most people live in cities across the world, that making sure somewhere as big as New York is leading on adaptation will, I'm sure, be helpful for cities with less resources. And I think it's really exciting to talk about those other benefits, Alia, that can happen for adaptation plans, because we often think about this as in negative terms, as what we've got to do, and it's kind of often put in that frame of being a sacrifice. But actually, yeah, there can be benefits for communities. But in Australia, what does that adaptation look like? Do we have a similar plan for adaptation like overseas countries do?
So when we look at the domestic context in Australia, what our own research has shown and what the IPCC research has shown is that adaptation policy in Australia lacks coordination across levels, so across state and federal levels, and it's often pushed onto local government areas. And Australia does not have a national climate risk assessment. And the problem with that is that we then don't really have the understanding of which communities are most vulnerable to climate impacts, and therefore we're not able to implement strategic plans to help those vulnerable communities be able to adapt to climate impacts. And a national climate risk assessment is actually mandated under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that Australia is a party to. And we have committed to doing a national climate risk assessment and really should undertake that.
But we haven't yet. Are we planning to?
We haven't done it yet. And so that's one of the key things that came out of this report is that the barriers to effective adaptation are really being too responsive to particular events, to particular extreme events. And we see that with our current government not planning for future impacts and just responding to particular climate extreme events. And the problem with that is that there's not dedicated funding to enable communities to plan forward. And if you have a 1 in 100-year flood that then becomes more and more frequent, those communities need to be supported to, align urban planning policy and their critical infrastructure to events that will become more and more frequent.
Lismore, it was reported last year, was left off a Commonwealth scheme as a priority location for natural disaster resilience funding, where they could have been open to a grant, and they were all amazed by it. So yes, there are lots of rescues going on. Yes, we are paying attention to that. But it's always a good time to say, is enough being done? Does the government need to reassess how it's approaching this?
So I can absolutely assure you and your viewers that the Emergency Response Fund is being used as it was legislated, as Labor supported it to be legislated. And $50 million is being put forward annually for flood mitigation projects to support local councils and state governments who are responsible for flood levies, and they're very expensive.
It's a huge report, Johanna. I can't even imagine how long you've spent on it. I'm sure you've been watching some of the coverage coming in. Are there any other key messages that you'd like people to take home from this report in particular?
Well, I think in particular, I mean, I would agree, for in the domestic context. I mean, we have the Government Agency for Recovery and Resilience, we have disaster risk reduction frameworks, and we have national adaptation guidance at the moment. But I think what's really coming from the report for all the countries is that we need to have much more specific adaptation planning and policies as well. And that really, ties to adaptation finance as well. So we need to start looking at, like it was said, where are the really vulnerable communities across the nations, but also, what are the strategies that we can already now put in place? And I think there is, with adaptation, I think there is often the misunderstanding that, with sea level rise, that's something that's going to happen in, 50 years' time, so we don't have to worry about it right now. But with adaptation options, there's often really long implementation times. So it's vital that long-term planning and implementation is actually increased, particularly in the next decade. So that can help us to close some of the adaptation gaps. But those are often, unevenly distributed as well. And they, and different communities and different regions have, really different constraints. What the report is saying, it's basically we have to start now. So we have to start looking at the long term and thinking, okay, looking at the projections and understanding what those changes mean. And some of the changes have already happened a lot faster than we thought.
Alia, long-term planning when it comes to climate change has not been a particular strong suit, for example, of the coalition government in recent terms. But that idea there that, some of these adaptation plans will take a long time to implement. They're obviously going to need finance, agreement of communities, consultation, all of that takes a long time. But we're just not seeing that action, are we?
No, we're not at the moment. And other countries like the US and the UK have mandated periodic climate risk assessments and things like that. And most OECD countries have national adaptation planning. So we really do need to step up our adaptation action in Australia. And we also need to make sure that adaptation policy aligns with mitigation policy and that these don't become siloed issues like they have become in Australia. Mm-hmm. And that's crucial to ensure that we don't have maladaptation or, mitigation and adaptation policies that end up conflicting with each other, because climate change is not an issue that is going away anytime soon. It's already here now and it will be with us for a long time. So we need to make sure that across different levels of government and across communities, adaptation and mitigation policies support each other. And the IPCC report does say that that is very necessary.
Yeah, so if we're trying to, go on a nice drive somewhere, we don't want to have our foot on the accelerator and the brake at the same time by, for example, giving massive subsidies to the fossil fuel industry at the same time, I don't know, as trying to reduce emissions. Might that be a good idea to avoid?
Exactly. Not driving our diesel cars along roads next to, coastal areas that are going to be flooded in every year for the next 50 years or something like that. It doesn't really make sense.
Viable solutions are on the table, but scientists and experts are urging action now, not later.
For example, that might mean better land management. It might mean more flood defences, or even moving some communities away from the water altogether. Whatever the solution, it's going to be expensive, and the longer we wait, the more expensive it's going to get.
Johanna, I want to come back to you just on that finance picture at the moment. You mentioned that briefly, but obviously Australia is one of the richest countries in the world. We could choose to finance adaptation, but there'd be a lot of other countries around the world that will need a lot of help. Can you talk to me a little bit just about that finance picture and what's required?
Yeah, I mean, in the report, we do say that the adaptation finance, as it currently stands, is insufficient. So, for instance, most of the kind of global commitments and the climate finance has really gone to mitigation activities. And as you heard the Secretary General say, his aim is to get all the climate finance to go 50-50, so 50 for adaptation, 50 for mitigation. We did look at the global numbers, but it's really difficult to get a proper picture as to how much is needed and where. Because I think the adaptation needs really differ across the different countries and even at the community level. And there's also the question of private sector finance, so that sometimes is not factored in. So I don't think at the moment we know that it's not enough, but we don't have the specific numbers always to say, well, this is how much it should be. I think the Secretary General's comment on getting to 50-50, I mean, that has been the aspiration. It just hasn't happened. And I think we also need to look at the least developing countries as well. And there was at COP26, for instance, there was a massive increase in the funding for the adaptation fund. But that's still, it's still insufficient as to what's actually needed. Because we also have to look at the different kinds of impacts. So, for instance, for small islands, there's sea level rise, but there's also tropical cyclones. I mean, hurricanes in the Caribbean. And some of the things that we have already seen in the last few years is that, if you get a massive category 5 category, well, we don't have category 6, and some people are actually saying we need a category 6 category to describe these storms because they are so extreme.
That's so scary, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And so there's a lot of things for rebuilding, but also planning, and there's adaptation needs are just going to go through the roof. And I think we need to be ready also to start thinking about, especially with us, small island nations in the Pacific, how can Australia really start supporting their adaptation processes? I mean, I know that the current government, for instance, has pledged more climate finance for the countries, but a lot of that has gone to infrastructure. And adaptation is not just about infrastructure. And I think that's one of the really clear messages coming from this report, is that adaptation is not just about building seawalls or roads or bridges. All of that is part of adaptation, but it's more also, it's the social, cultural, economic decisions that we make. It's how we keep our communities safe and how we start planning for this impact. So that's definitely one of the key messages that I like to get across.
It's not just about infrastructure. Alia, I just want to finish up with you. Obviously, at the end of the day, we're trying to protect communities in the long term. And we've certainly seen with things like the Black Summer bushfires that in the aftermath, there's still, people living in caravans there. And we've been fortunate enough to have a La Niña summer, but bushfires are a regular feature of Australian life. I mean, how important at the end of the day is this to get right?
It's crucial. And going back to what Johanna said about climate finance and having that 50-50 split between mitigation and adaptation, Australia is actually reasonably good with that 50-50 split. But the problem is where most of our adaptation funding is actually for overseas, and it comes from within our existing aid budget. So it's not additional money to help vulnerable communities like in small island nations adapt to climate impacts. And then domestically, when we lack adaptation planning, we are forgetting about vulnerable communities within our own country. And when we will have escalating extreme weather events like more regular bushfires and more extreme flooding.
And heat waves.
And all these types of things that we are already experiencing and will only get worse without proper mitigation. We are forgetting about our vulnerable communities here, and we need to not only help communities overseas adapt, we need to help vulnerable communities in Australia adapt.
Well, we might wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Johanna and Alia. We really appreciate your time. This episode was recorded live on Tuesday, the 1st of March 2022, and things may have changed since recording. And we send all our best wishes to people currently affected by floods in Lismore, New South Wales, and elsewhere in Queensland. We're certainly looking on with horror and hoping that everyone is as safe and sound as possible. The IPCC report is available at ipcc.ch, and you can visit the australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, including on adaptation, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a ~N~T, and Dr. Johanna Nalau is at Dr. J Nalau. That's Nalau. Alia Armistead is at Alia Armistead, and this episode was produced by Jennifer Macy. You can find her at Jennifer Macy, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Don't forget to leave us a review if you enjoy the podcast, as it helps other people to find Follow the Money. Stay safe out there, everyone, and thanks for listening.